Welcome back, true believers and all you merry Marvelites, to another very exciting and extremely important Marvel's Avengers related video. After 3 long years of waiting for this game ever since its initial reveal in January of 2017, and now having finally completed the full campaign for myself, we've now arrived at my official review for Marvel's Avengers. But before we dive into anything and everything relating to this game, I do want to give a huge thank you to Square Enix for actually being kind enough to provide me a free early review copy of Marvel's Avengers before its worldwide release. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to thoroughly formulate my whole opinion on the game if I hadn't received the copy as early as I did. But even more so, I wouldn't be able to actually review the game in the first place if it hadn't been for all of you supporting me every step of the way. All of you viewers continuously inspire me on a daily basis, and without your continued support, I wouldn't be able to do what I am currently doing now. So from the bottom of my heart, I can't thank you enough for all the support you've shown me over these past few years. And considering that this is just the beginning for Marvel's Avengers, with even more Marvel games greatness to occur in the future, I for one can't wait to see what's in store next. But without further ado everyone, please enjoy the review.
Do I believe that the most important thing to do is to do the right thing? Absolutely. The biggest problem people have, including me, sometimes it's hard to know what the right thing is. But certainly, doing the right thing is one of the most important things in life. I would imagine everybody wants to do what's right.
Good isn't a thing you are. It's a thing you do.
To quote Stan the Man Lee himself, one of the main reasons as to exactly why the Marvel property as a whole is so relatable and connective to general audiences across the globe, primarily in regards to the characters they craft, the worlds they build, and the narratives that they tell, is that Marvel puts the human in the superhuman. And because of that mantra alone, Marvel has managed to pretty much immortalize these characters that are beloved from the comics within the entirety of pop culture history. However, how do you take characters like a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist, an actual god of thunder, a masterful tactical spy, a super soldier out of time, and a literal Hulk and apply them within a AAA video game format, the likes of which we've never seen be accomplished for characters of this scale and or magnitude? And as for exactly what the answer is to that question, is that you have to try something new. As for whether or not that be for better or worse, it all comes down to a matter of perspective. And this doesn't just revolve around the game's single-player campaign, but also the much wider and broader multiplayer elements that are entailed within this title. Now, just in case any of you managed to miss it, I did in fact review the game's online beta, which did release a few weeks prior to the game's main launch. And while the majority of criticisms that I did make for the beta review still stand firm after playing the main game for myself, there is still quite a lot that the full experience of Marvel's Avengers has to offer. Although, in my personal opinion, that's kind of one of the biggest problems about Marvel's Avengers as a whole. Alongside of the overarching narrative, the various heroes that you can play as, the ever-expansive multiplayer mode, as well as the massive live service components, this game is trying to juggle a lot at once. So much so, in fact, that it doesn't necessarily feel like Marvel's Avengers truly knows what type of game it wants to be. Now, in particular, it almost comes off as if Marvel's Avengers is specifically torn between two separate worlds, which in this case we can see directly inputted in the game itself as two separate modes. The first of which primarily relates to the game's core single-player campaign, and the second of which is that being the Avengers Initiative, where this mode is going to hold the majority of the endgame content, and in doing so is going to attempt to influence gamers to continuously play through this game for years to come. Because Marvel's Avengers is trying to be so many things all at the same time, it's pretty hard to narrow down exactly what type of experience this game truly is. Which is why I wanted to take the opportunity to fully dive into both the game's main campaign and the post-game content with the Avengers Initiative, and review them as two separate experiences entirely. Because while you will be spending a majority of your time simply playing as one of these iconic heroes and smashing AIM robots to pieces, you'll certainly find yourself becoming more and more attached to these characters as the narrative progresses, and wanting to repeatedly see what is going to happen next. So to begin with the main story of Marvel's Avengers revolves around you as Kamala Khan, who is the main protagonist of the entire narrative, to reassemble the Avengers in an attempt to defeat AIM, otherwise known as Advanced Idea Mechanics. And as far as an Avengers story goes, I think it's safe to say that this one did do a pretty good job. Now, it's not like that this is the greatest Avengers story ever told or anything, but it does do a pretty decent job of trying to individualize itself from the other representations that we have seen of the heroes in other forms of media. The main one, of course, being that of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of the characters of the core Avengers team do feel like very accurate representations of their comic book counterparts, while also trying to modernize them in new and different ways that we haven't necessarily seen before. Still, the length of the campaign itself does range approximately around 10 to 12 hours. And while there were some pretty massive blockbuster set pieces that truly showcase the scope of the Avengers team as a whole, which also displays a narrative that truly showcases what makes these heroes so special by fully embracing their own unique powers, I will say that in some areas it did feel rushed. Primarily in regards to rebuilding the Chimera helicarrier as the narrative progressed, as well as the return of Thor, who kinda just shows up out of nowhere during the midpoint of the story. Another downside as to how the core campaign is structured is that some of the main missions that you end up doing are simply just reskins of Warzone missions. So while the set pieces may be enjoyable, they're pretty far and few in between. Whereas when you have to undergo some of these Warzone missions as a simple story mission, it feels like there wasn't all that much thought put into them. This'll range from you pretty much having to relentlessly defeat enemies, take out a specific structure, hack a few data terminals, or do everything all at once. Now surely, experiencing these types of Warzone missions online with 3 of your other friends during the multiplayer co-op is definitely going to be an entertaining experience. That same type of repetitive mission structure shouldn't be at all included within the single player story. So even though I would have appreciated it if the campaign lasted for just a bit longer, I still think it managed to get the job done. Not to mention that when you're actually playing the single player, there still are quite a few technical glitches and errors that do occur when playing the game all by yourself. Even after installing the 18GB patch for Marvel's Avengers on launch day, I still personally experienced a massive amount of in-game glitches, primarily with that of frame rate drops, characters phasing through objects, general crashes of the game during certain missions, inconsistent and unresponsive companion AI, and some other pretty jarring bugs that do occur throughout the entirety of the game. But hopefully, even if the game didn't manage to run all that well on release, even when I was playing the game on performance mode, hopefully most if not all of these issues can be fixed in future patches, alongside of the brand new free content that is going to be included within the game, again, quote unquote, for years to come. Besides the main story itself being the highlight of the entire game, there is still quite a lot more to look forward to in the future with upcoming updates. As we already know, this fully relates to brand new heroes that will be playable within the Marvel's Avengers roster, brand new regions to explore and missions to partake in. All of this will be arriving within the game in the future at no additional cost. Starting off with characters that we know of already, like that of Kate Bishop, Hawkeye, and of course Spider-Man, with even more characters to be included within the game's roster for years on at no additional cost. So while there are some pretty glaring issues with the overall live service and monetization structure that Marvel's Avengers has, which we will dive into a bit later, I still have to give the team props for including all these characters for free, which is surely going to make the narrative expansion for this game even more interesting. And while this might be just a small nitpick, even though I do think it would be a pretty cool feature, is that I wish we could actually customize the helicarrier ourselves to tailor exactly how we would want the Chimera to look in our own personalized Avengers base. Considering how we're already able to do the same thing with the characters' gear sets and cosmetics, having a customization system for their core bases like that of the Chimera, Anthill, and other locations to be added down the line would be pretty darn cool. But for an Avengers game on a scale as big as this one, you would think that they would try and deliver on epicness on every single front imaginable. And while that might be true in some cases, it doesn't necessarily live up in other areas. Primarily for me is with that of the boss fights as well as the soundtrack. While playing the main story for myself, I found the boss fights to be pretty straightforward. All of the enemies in this game, both relating to the main foes and the bosses themselves, are pretty much damage sponges. So all you have to do is completely wail on them until their life bar is fully depleted, with not a lot of thought or strategy put into how you take on these enemies, which in turn made the boss fights within the game, not including the last one, pretty subpar in certain areas. games. And as for the game's soundtrack, which might be considered a minuscule aspect about the game considering everything else that is included within it, is that I don't think it truly delivered on a fully immersive Avengers score, and felt a bit dull at certain points during the game. The sound design itself is easily my least favorite aspect about Marvel's Avengers, even more so than the microtransactions that occur within the online marketplace. Everything from the game's soundtrack to the overall sound effects that occur when hitting enemies just sound completely lifeless and mundane, primarily in the case of Captain America's shield and Thor's hammer Mjolnir. While the camera shaking and controller vibrations do give off some sense of impact when hitting enemies, the overall audio effects when hitting enemies with any character's weapons don't sound satisfying in the slightest. And to be blunt, for characters as iconic as the Avengers, that aspect of the game is pretty darn disappointing to me. But what's not a disappointment to me is actually what I consider to be the saving grace of the entirety of the game's main campaign, and that is none other than the main protagonist herself, Miss Marvel, aka Kamala Khan, played by the wonderfully enthralling and absolutely energetic Sandra Saad. Now, to be completely honest, when it was first revealed that Kamala Khan was going to be the main protagonist of the very first AAA Avengers game, I was a bit hesitant to say the least, considering that the overall portrayal that she does have in the Marvel Comics mainstream does have a lot left to be desired, especially knowing that she's a fairly recent character within the Marvel lore in general, only being about 6 or 7 years old at this point, is that it's a pretty bold and ambitious move to make her the core character of the entire story. However, I'm happy to say that the writers over at Marvel Games and Crystal Dynamics managed to pull it off in an extremely compelling way. And in actuality, the entirety of the Marvel's Avengers cast, considering that the majority of them are pretty top tier voice actors, did manage to provide some pretty engaging performances all around. Although, if there was anyone in particular that I had to point out where I didn't necessarily connect with their portrayal of the character, is actually Nolan North as Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. Every single time I hear Iron Man within the game, I can only hear Nolan North as Nolan North, and not Nolan North as Tony Stark, which is shocking considering how much I love Nolan North as a voice actor. But if anything, I actually think that Sandra Saad as Kamala Khan completely stole the show. And as far as the villains go within the story, as George Tarleton slowly becomes MODOK over the progression of the narrative, as well as Monica Rappaccini becoming AIM's lead scientist supreme, I really did enjoy the performances for what they were in regards to the villains, but I didn't necessarily connect thoroughly with George Tarleton's motivation during the overall story arc. So even though there are some pretty good moments with the villains of this game, the main character that you want to focus on is Kamala Khan herself. The writers managed to do a pretty good job of trying to keep true to the core traits of Kamala from the comics, while also modernizing her and making her more mature for this brand new Avengers tale. And yes, while there are some awkward moments of Kamala within the story during her bits of fangirling as well as her connecting to the other Avengers characters, the majority of the time it does exude a lot of heart and soul that we know Marvel is capable of. Plus, I also have to give major props to the writers and the creative director of the game, Sean Askai, for actually trying their best to naturally incorporate Kamala's Muslim heritage in her character. There's actually some pretty engaging scenes within the story between Kamala and her father, as well as Kamala interacting with the other Avengers, which do fully display exactly what Kamala is going through and how it relates to her on a personal level. Say whatever you want about this particular topic, but I personally believe that representation does matter, and based on the character that we received of Kamala within this game, I can easily see this being extremely important to a lot of people down the line. Now again, if I was only reviewing Marvel's Avengers from a purely narrative perspective, I would say that it has a lot of heart and soul that fans both young and old across the world will surely cherish. And specifically, I believe that Sandra Saad herself absolutely crushes it as Kamala Khan, and in turn breathes life in a new hero fit for the modern age. And while the Avengers story isn't perfect by any means, I still think it truly encapsulates everything that we know and love about Marvel as a whole. And because of that, I'm going to give the campaign itself a solid 8 out of 10 rating. If there was any one reason I would recommend Marvel's Avengers to you to purchase, even though I would actually recommend to wait until they add more of the post-launch content, is easily based on the story alone and experience the Marvel Universe from a brand new and young perspective. Because if you're someone who doesn't really care about any of the multiplayer or online elements that Marvel's Avengers has, I do believe that the campaign itself will more than likely win you over one way or another. Although I can't say the same thing about the massive online elements and live service looter shooter grind fest that Marvel's Avengers has in spades. Once again, feel free to rewatch my overall review of the Marvel's Avengers beta, because the majority of the criticisms that I did have there still remain alive and well. On the plus side of the looter-shooter elements of the game, which might be one of the few pros that I have about it, is that there are a lot of in-depth progression systems included within the overall upgrade tree. Throughout my main playthrough of the game's campaign, I only pretty much unlocked a few skills of the primary skill tree, with the entirety of the specialty and mastery skill trees left untouched. So as you continuously grind for XP and trying to unlock gear which can enhance your combat skills even further, it does add a bit of depth which I was not expecting. However, this isn't the case with the overall issues that still remained in the beta, which do appear here again in the full game, mainly with that of the tacked on gear system, repetitive mission structure, and opening chests in an Avengers video game. I do understand why elements like gear might be important when you're trying to customize your character's playstyle, but things like grinding for gear and unlocking chests while trying to explore these barren wastelands that you fight through in the Warzone missions don't really seem all that appealing to me once you do the same objective over and over and over again. A lot of these Warzone missions are monotonous at worst and tedious at best, but again, playing these online missions with a group of your friends will make it a little bit more worth your while. As it stands right now, there's not a whole lot of innovation or ingenuity when it comes to the missions that apply within the war zones. Still, like we did see in the most recent War Table presentation, there are going to be different mission types added when new characters are included in the roster, as well as things like raids and mega hives trying to expand the overall playstyle that you can involve with all your roster of heroes. So maybe things will start to open up a bit more once new things are added, but as of right now, there's not a whole lot of depth when it comes to the missions. But of course, the biggest topic of controversy as a whole when it comes to Marvel's Avengers is obviously the incredibly misused microtransaction system, as well as the challenge cards that apply to each hero within the game itself. Like we know already, as it was confirmed by Crystal Dynamics themselves a while ago, is that there are going to be specific items locked directly behind a paywall that you can only unlock in the game by using microtransactions. And in case you're unaware, this only includes cosmetic items which only change the visual appearance of your character, and doesn't involve anything that relates to in-game progression because you can only do that by playing the game yourself. Still, the items that are locked only behind a paywall in the marketplace is that of costumes, nameplates, emotes, and something which I cannot stand in the slightest is actually in-game takedowns. I don't care what anyone says, but locking basic combat animations behind a paywall is beyond unacceptable in my opinion. And it only gets worse knowing that not only are some of these animations only unlockable by paying with them with real-life money, but once Crystal Dynamics starts including other heroes in the game post-launch, you will then have to manually buy for their challenge cards at a base price of $10 simply to unlock them. Cosmetic items like costumes, nameplates, and emotes are less than important to me. But when it comes to actual animations that fully flesh out a character's moveset and combat style is just incredibly ridiculous, especially if some of those animations are locked directly behind the use of microtransactions. The challenge cards themselves are flawed as well because in general it takes way too long to try and unlock one specific item in the challenge cards even with the use of daily challenges. It's even more ludicrous when you find out that these in-game credits can only be bought at a lowest price of $5 or a highest price of $100 or more. So if you're someone who doesn't have enough time to try and continuously grind through this game just to unlock one specific cosmetic item, you're gonna have to try and buy that item through the use of microtransactions and paywall methods. Now, for a live service game that is going to be providing free content for years to come, I do understand that they have to try and make their money somehow. But still, structuring the monetization aspect of Marvel's Avengers in such a weird manner just completely turns me off to some of the online components that this game has. In the end, everyone, we're still unaware as to exactly how well Marvel's Avengers will do in terms of sales, but for me personally, I don't know exactly whether or not the brand recognition of the Avengers name alone will be enough to sell copies of this game on its day one release, and even furthermore once they add other characters. However, I will say that it will be a pretty intriguing experience to see exactly where Marvel's Avengers will end up once all the post-launch content has been added within the game itself. And if I had to give a specific review of the base game alone without the inclusion of the campaign and simply judging it off of the online aspects and co-op elements itself with the online live service elements and looter-shooter aspects, I'll actually let Tony Stark himself rate the game for me.
I'll give you a 7 out of 10.
In summary everyone, Marvel's Avengers is an extremely ambitious product, and while there is some good and some bad elements here, I still think that this will be a product to learn from in the coming years. Especially considering that Marvel Games and Square Enix are contracted with one another in a multi-year, multi-game partnership, I for one am very interested to see exactly where Marvel is going next. And as for exactly what's going to happen on that front is something we're just gonna have to wait and see on. But with all that said everyone, that is my official review of Marvel's Avengers, developed directly by Square Enix, Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, Nixie Software, and Marvel Games. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below, and please tell me exactly how you're feeling about Marvel's Avengers after its day one release. This surely couldn't have been easy on the developers, especially with the current pandemic that we're now currently facing. So huge props to them for actually managing to deliver a huge experience like this during the current circumstances we now face. And since this is just the beginning of this game with all the extra content that is planned post-launch, it's simply just a good time to be a Marvel fan no matter what. But until next time everyone, thank you all so much for watching, stay merry Marvelites, and without further ado, peace out.
Aren't you gonna say the thing?
What?
Avengers assemble.